You are a fascist, statist, totalitarianist, and you support oppression. This is the sort of ad hominem abuse that we've seen from libertarians and Randroids throughout Western society, whose arguments have descended into meaningless personal attacks in much the same way as a Christian fundamentalist who tells you that you are going to hell if you don't change your ways, or that they will pray for you. In essence, it means they have no case to present. Your religion of statism is like Fundamentalist Christianity, where Creationists deny the theory of evolution. This is a variation of the same sort of psychological projection we see from the likes of Creationists who tell atheists that they follow the religion of atheism, and it's just as childish and pathetic as the ad hominem attacks against people who do not want to eradicate the rule of law from modern society. The other problem is that in doing so, these people also behave as though they have the truth on their side, as if their worship of the almighty dollar is the only correct course for society to follow, as if it is self-evident that without a free market, the world will fall apart, and that anyone who disagrees or denies this is too stupid to live. Well, I don't see the self-evident nature of these claims, and I haven't dropped dead yet, so there we are. To address this particular talking point, all one has to do is point out that libertarianism, objectivism, anarcho-capitalism, and full-blown lawless anarchy are all political ideologies, just as democracy, the totalitarian state, communism, republicanism, and various other types of government are also political ideologies. As such, they do not enjoy the same status of evidential support that a scientific theory such as evolution and gravity enjoys, and should not be paraded around as such. I understand this, as do many people across the world. Many fundamentalists of any political persuasion, including libertarianism and anarchy, unfortunately are incapable of grasping this distinction, and will use a variation of this talking point as a means of declaring their position as valid and dismissing their critics' position, rather than actually acknowledging that they might possibly be wrong or addressing any actual arguments. Some will even use it as an opening gambit in the conversation. And those that do any of these things are best left to their own devices. There is simply no talking to them. Rejecting the Economic Freedom Index because it is a Libertarian Think Tank's product is the genetic fallacy. People who make this argument while simultaneously rejecting responses critical to them out of hand on the basis that, quote, your religion prevents you from seeing reason, end quote, and all manner of other assorted ad hominem attacks demonstrates a certain amount of hypocrisy. But let's deal with this one. Libertarianism, as I've already stated, is a political ideology. It is not a scientific theory with 50,000 plus peer-reviewed papers based on the evidence of the fossil record, DNA samples, and practical observations in the real world, nor does it have practical applications whose success is primarily because of the knowledge that the theory describes. As such, I am under no obligation to accept the statistics that have undoubtedly been drawn up from a biased reading of statistical variables read by obviously biased human beings in support of their political beliefs. It is the same sort of thing as creationists who examine the evidence for evolution and then claim that DNA evidence actually supports creationism, and will even go as far as to post statistical variables that supposedly support their claims. It is the same sort of thing that people who cite Rushton and Jensen in support of their racist viewpoint, claiming that just because these researchers were funded by the Pioneer Fund, we shouldn't reject them because to do so would be committing the genetic fallacy. Sorry, but you do not get to claim such a thing, because you are assuming that the resulting information from an obviously biased source, created by an obviously biased political think tank, set up by a group that is obviously biased and dedicated to the same political ideology, is itself going to be unbiased. And I'm sorry, but this is not an assumption that anyone should be prepared to make. And spare me your comparison to biological evolution studies. Those are backed up by testable, repeatable evidence, unlike your political ideology. Subsidizing bad decisions helps no one. This is true. Subsidizing bad decisions indeed helps no one. This is something I agree with, although many of the more fundamentalist types will deny this and accuse me of lying. Examples of bad decisions include the high fructose corn syrup that has come about as a result of corn subsidies. Dealing with this issue is not straightforward, but removing those subsidies would probably be a start. This, however, is not a reason to remove government regulation, nor is it, for example, a good reason not to implement, or to keep, universal healthcare. Well, what about this decision by this person that is really, really bad? This one doesn't take much of a response, but it should be obvious even to the most naive observer that a bad decision by a particular politician does not invalidate the concept of a government, nor does a really bad decision by a military general invalidate the concept of an armed force service. Forcing me to pay for all services including war, torture, mass murder and the public school system that makes people deny this reality is unfair. Life itself is unfair. Perhaps you would like to tell people in Somalia how unfair it is that you are being forced to pay taxes that go toward military and public schooling while the vast majority of them are undernourished and in some cases starving because of high unemployment, lack of social protections, housing and other essential services that people in modern society rely upon to have a decent quality of life. Furthermore, the type of person who talks about public schooling teaching people to live in denial is often the type of person who says something along the lines of this.
Just statistically speaking, students in public education get dumber. It does not help them. Public education stinks.
In other words, they make no coherent argument, much less even a cogent one. You know nothing of economics. From my own point of view, I have never pretended to be an economic expert, unlike a certain minarchist libertarian who has pretended to be an expert by claiming to have a degree that he doesn't actually have. I do not know a great deal about economics, but what I do know is that economic theory is far more complex than a simplification that involves the supply and demand curve. Often, however, these people make the statement that you know nothing about economics as a euphemism for you do not subscribe to the same economic theory that I do, therefore you're wrong. What they do not acknowledge, however, is that I am not arguing from a standpoint of economics. Economics is only a small part of the issue. I argue primarily from the basis of civic responsibility and, more importantly, ethics, especially when it comes to things such as healthcare and safety regulations. And while I can compromise on the issue of regulation in some capitalistic markets, there are others where I have no compromise. In essence, telling me I know nothing of economics is nothing more than an excuse to ignore the points that I am making. You were threatening people with violence in order to get them to do what you want. This is an appeal to emotion. A strict literal interpretation of this talking point would make it an act of violence to do so much as order someone to leave your home if they are no longer welcome, and then enforcing said order by taking them by the arm and escorting them off of your premises if they refuse. However, those of us who are sane understand that while the strict definition of violence does include things such as bodily throwing someone into a jail cell for committing a crime against society, applying that strict definition indiscriminately is unreasonable. Detaining someone on suspicion of drinking in public and then arresting them because they refused to show ID when instructed to do so is not an act of initiation of force or violence outside of that strict definition that such people prefer. Detaining someone on suspicion of drinking in public and then arresting them because they subsequently refused to show ID when instructed to do so is within the lawful execution of a police officer's duties and is reasonable when a suspected offender does not submit to lawful police questioning. The issue of violence requires further discussion, and so I will return to it in a future talking point. Somewhat on a tangent, libertarians would never be able to get away with this kind of whiny, bleating, self-centered conduct if they were drafted into national service. The army would turn them into men in no time at all. You called me a lying sack of shit, therefore you are emotionally unstable, insane, and demonstrate an intense hatred of me. This is often used by people who have no ability to see the grey areas in any of life's situations. It is not the case that because you do not like someone you automatically must hate them. It is the same sort of response from a person who has the same mindset to assume that if you do not let people do whatever the hell they want, you are committing violence against them or initiating force against them. There is no room for grey areas in these people's lives. Incidentally, this sort of thinking is why I don't like psychometric testing that proposes two ideas that you agree or disagree with in a single question. For example, the question, do you like teamwork and leadership or do you prefer creativity, is a false dichotomy that excludes a whole host of responses to the question. And in the same vein, the question, do you support the libertarian ideal of the non-initiation of force or do you support stealing people's money, ignores the nuances of the situation and reveals an inherent bias in the questioner's moral beliefs. Also, the emotional instability argument, claim of insanity and claim of intense hatred in someone for calling them a liar and a sack of shit is simply another ad hominem attack. Authority is superstition. Okay, calm down. Everybody stop laughing. I know that was hilarious, but still. Authority is actually a concept that has applicability in the real world, and this has been demonstrated throughout recorded history. The authority of a government to govern its territory has been in effect since territories were large enough to require centralized governance. It is not imaginary, it is not pretend, and it is not the same as a belief in a supernatural deity. By this reasoning, you might as well claim that the authority of a CEO to control its employees within a company is also superstitious, and that they don't have the right to dictate policy and rules to their employees. I demand that you point out to me exactly where you have addressed a point I have made exactly in the comments section of whatever video you're talking about, or you'll know better than NephilimFree. This is utterly ridiculous. It is the same sort of thing that David John Wellman mentioned in his Talking Points videos, and like him, I say that I imagine that even NephilimFree has commitments in his life. Regardless of whether this is true or not, demanding that I point out exactly where it is I specifically addressed an argument or a point in a discussion while not having the courtesy to do so oneself is hypocritical. And frankly, if you're too lazy to read through the comment section of a video after I've responded by pointing out that I have already answered a question and your response is, "Oh my god, you want me to spend hours trawling through the comment section," then you've got bigger problems than just not being able to get an answer to a point I've already addressed. Government is inefficient or ineffective, therefore it's not legitimate. The ridiculousness of this argument is such that I don't feel I should have to reply to it. However, for the purposes of being thorough, I will do so. The effectiveness of any given set of regulations, laws, government agencies, powers, or even an entire government itself is not an argument against the legitimacy of the government to hold power, the legitimacy of laws to exist, and the legitimacy of a law enforcement agency to enforce said laws. And if anyone needs me to expand further on this, I would recommend they begin at the very beginning by going back to school. This is basic common sense, and shouldn't need to be elaborated on. You cannot own land. You cannot own trees, mountains, rivers, lakes, oceans, or anything else in that land unless it is being utilised. No reason for why you cannot own land was ever given by the commenter who made this suggestion. The argument that you cannot own a person as a slave is legitimate because people are people, sentient beings with their own identity and individuality, and therefore should not be considered as property. This is why I am not a libertarian, and I will expand upon this point later, but there is no similar explanation as to why you cannot own land. However, the commenter who made this argument elaborated on it by specifying that, quote, "If you mow a lawn, you own it. If you build a house, you own it. If you farm a field, you own it." End quote. Well, by this logic, if you build roads for transportation, you own the roads. If you build the infrastructure that services the land, you own the infrastructure. If you build public housing, you own the public housing. The commenter appears to be appealing to the right of a private industry to own whatever they've developed, but denies the government of a country the same right to govern territory that it's acquired. You can't have it both ways. I'd also like to see the reaction from property owners who now have to give up their property rights to the gardeners who have been mowing their lawns, or to landowners who have now given up their property rights to farmers who previously rented farming space from them because of this definition of utility defines property that we're seeing here. It's absolutely fucking ludicrous, honestly. Deducting income taxes from you is like claiming ownership of you, the person, and is no better than slavery. This is utter nonsense. Income taxes are deducted because you have made an income off the back of the infrastructure of the society that you live in. The vast majority of businesses in every territory wouldn't exist without the society they service, and that society has selected, by majority vote, to be governed according to the laws of the land. I'm referring to Western democracies here, of course, not totalitarian regimes like North Korea. Being required to pay a percentage of the income you earned is not equivalent to slavery. Slaves earned absolutely nothing, had absolutely no property, and had no residence of their own. They worked according to the whims of their owners and could be bought and sold like commodities on the open market. But by this reasoning, even the slave owners of 300 years ago would themselves have been slaves, except that they also owned property. The simple fact is that your income is not earned in isolation. Your income is earned by working within the society that you live in, and that entails using the society's infrastructure, interacting with other members of the society, and utilizing the currency system that the society that you are living in uses. Now, this oversimplification doesn't cover every possible nuance that working within a society entails, but you get the essential point. Since your income was not earned in isolation, expecting to be able to keep it all is an unreasonable and self-centered expectation. Governments murdered close to 300 million people in the past century, therefore statists are dangerous. This is equivalent to blaming every Christian on the planet for the crimes committed by Hitler. I expect this from religious fundamentalists who equate atheists with Stalin or Mao, but I don't expect it from self-proclaimed rationalists. While it is true that some governments on the planet have been responsible for crimes against humanity, it does not by extension mean that the very concept of governance is dangerous. To suggest otherwise is a hasty generalization coupled with a correlation implies causation fallacy, calling statists dangerous as a result, and even going as far as calling people who support the concept of government statists in the first place, is nothing more than an ad hominem attack. Democracy is illegitimate because the American government is corrupt. You have to assume that the majority has the right to vote to force the minority of people to do things against their will, as if majority opinion justifies anything. You have to assume politicians won't be corrupted by the process. This is the same kind of logic that can be directed at private enterprise. If I wanted to be just as ludicrous, I could say, private enterprise is illegitimate because Walmart is corrupt. You have to assume that those people with money have the right to control those who do not, that they have a right to buy power, as if money controls everything. You have to assume that CEOs and business owners won't be corrupted by the process of wealth acquisition. Just because there are problems inherent in any given political ideology doesn't completely and utterly invalidate them. There are problems in all of them, and there are possible advantages. You cannot declare one political ideology as invalid or illegitimate because problems exist with the ability to apply it practically, while demanding that others accept your political ideology even though there are similar, or in some cases even worse, problems implementing your political ideology practically. Democracy is like magic, and you are like a theist who is upset when atheists don't accept your Jesus. This is nothing more than an ad hominem attack and is worth no further comment. Democracy is illegitimate because while it represents the will of the majority, it does not represent the will of everyone. This is true, but people who make this argument advocate for a society where a government is based on unanimity, which is unworkable in any practical sense. The response to this point may be, well, exactly, and that's why we shouldn't have governments that are bigger than tribal groups or family units. Okay, so what happens when you institute a debt system? Somebody goes out with a bunch of his friends and starts to conquer neighbouring villages and townspeople, absorbing them until one of two things happens. He either becomes ruler of the entire world, or enough people group together to stop him so that unanimity is no longer possible to make that group function. Democracy is like gang rape. 9 men want to gang rape a woman, and she doesn't want them to do that. Free market enterprise ideology can be argued as 9 men all competing to get to the one woman so that whoever gets to her first can take ownership of her and then sell her to the others. In both cases, this is nothing more than an appeal to emotion. Thankfully, the problem of majority opinion was foreseen by the founding fathers of the United States. As such, the majority cannot vote anything into law that infringes on the rights of any individual.